I've been wanting to make this video for a long time because millions of people out there are being told that they have bad feet, whether it's flat feet or high arches or they overpronate, but the result is they need support for the rest of their lives, special shoes and orthotics and whatnot. And that's just not what the research shows. And I've been wanting to get this video out for a long time. So in the next 20 minutes, I'm going to break down exactly what the data says, why this whole idea sounds so convincing to begin with, but why it also doesn't hold up when you actually look at the data. So if you or someone you know has been told that you need supportive shoes or orthotics for the rest of your life, you're going to want to watch this video. And nobody wants to think that they're like built wrong or they move wrong, because once you look at the level of evidence, three things become because if you believe that your feet are the problem, like you're built wrong or you move wrong, then the solution will always be something external, right? Different shoes, more support, another insert. And I looked at 29 other studies, thousands of participants, and what they found was that the motion of the foot is different than the motion of the shoe. And this is where things go from maybe this is overblown to this might actually be a problem. Because at the same time, your foot is doing less work, you are also being told it can't do the work, that it's flawed, that it needs help, possibly forever. Have you ever been told that you have bad feet, right? You overpronate, you have high arches, flat feet, and because of that, you need special shoes or orthotics, maybe for life. And once you hear that, it sticks, right? It becomes part of how you see your body. And nobody wants to think that they're like built wrong or they move wrong. But once someone is told that, it's a big problem. Because it's a lot easier to tell someone that story than it is to undo it. So in this video, we're going to do the harder thing. We're going to try to undo it. We're going to look at what research actually says about foot posture and pronation and injury risk. And I'm not talking about some subjective opinion that, your feet are too flat or your arches are too high or what someone thinks they saw when they saw you walk across a room. We're going to be talking about prospective studies, meta-analyses, and even bone pin research where they measure how the foot actually moves. Because once you look at the level of evidence, three things become very clear. First of all, the link between your foot shape and injury, or pronation and injury, is much weaker than what you've been told. And second, the way we measure things like pronation or arch height is far less accurate than most people realize. And third, the solutions that are often given, like lifelong orthotics, custom orthotics, special shoes, they may come with trade-offs that almost nobody explains. And here's why this matters. Because if you believe that your feet are the problem, like you're built wrong or you move wrong, then the solution will always be something external, right? Different shoes, more support, another insert. But if the foundation of that belief was wrong to begin with, then you've been giving away control of something that your body may actually be able to adapt to and improve. Now, there's a couple ways that you can sort of receive the information in this video. The first way is that the information is negative and pessimistic. The other way, and this is the way I hope you receive it, is that this should be exciting news and that it's self-empowering for you. In other words, that it's an optimistic message that puts you back in control of your health. So let's start with the foundation of this entire idea. Does your foot type actually predict injury? Because if it does, then maybe what you've been told makes sense. But if it doesn't, we've got a real problem. So we can look at individual studies, but there's a large meta-analysis that looked at this exact question, and it looked at 29 other studies, thousands of participants, and what they found was that the non-neutral foot, meaning flat feet or high arches, had a 23% increased chance of injury. Now on its surface, that sounds meaningful until you slow down for a second. A 23% chance is actually a pretty weak association, and the authors themselves said exactly that. The strength of the relationship is actually quite low. But here's where it gets really interesting, because most of those studies were cross-sectional studies or case control studies, meaning they looked at people who were already injured and asked them about their foot type. What's the problem with that? Well, if you're in pain, you might move differently because of the pain. Now that doesn't mean your foot type caused the injury, right? For example, if you sprain your ankle, you might limp. So limping and ankle sprains are associated, but you certainly wouldn't conclude limping caused your ankle sprain. So the association studies really aren't worth much more than the paper they're printed on. But when we look only at prospective studies, where researchers measure the foot type first and then follow people for going forward to see who gets injured, the associations largely disappear. In fact, the same meta-analysis of 29 studies, when they looked specifically at just prospective studies, the ones that actually follow people forward in time, which is a much better way of tracking who gets injured, the association for arch height largely disappeared. They said subgroup analysis revealed no significant associations for children with flat feet, cross-sectional studies, or prospective studies on high arches. Another more recent study looked at the arch heights of 300 runners, and they followed them for 2 years. In other words, it was a prospective study, and they found neither flat feet nor high arches had any increased risk of injury over those 2 years. So basically what I'm saying is, the better the study design, the weaker the relationship becomes. And that should make you pause, because if foot structure really was the main driver of injury, it should show up most clearly in prospective data. But it doesn't. Now here's where things get even more uncomfortable, because if we pretend for a minute that the posture of your foot did matter, which it doesn't, but let's just pretend for a minute that it does, we still have to ask a more basic question. Is overpronation even a real diagnosis? Here's the problem. There is no standard definition of what overpronation is. When someone tells you that they think you overpronate, that's all there is to go by. Their opinion. Only an opinion. Are they basing their opinion on the calcaneal eversion, on the navicular drop, on the foot posture index? Now, you don't need to know what those terms are. But then again, the person who told you that you overpronate probably doesn't know what they mean either. So don't feel bad. Now, some people get all fancy and they have a treadmill and they videotape the runner or the walker and they zoom in on the heel and they use that as their evidence for overpronation. But when someone tells you that you overpronate, what exactly are they measuring? Whether or not they're using a visual observation, a video analysis, or very technical markers placed on the skin or the shoe, it doesn't really matter, and here's why. The motion of the foot is different than the motion of the shoe, because your foot moves around in your shoe. And this is all well documented in biomechanical studies where markers are placed on the shoe and then also on the foot. And high-speed cameras and computers measure the exact position of the foot in the shoe. And the results clearly show that the foot moves around within the shoe. So if you change someone's shoe and then you videotape them again and you see that the shoe isn't pronating much, you still don't know what the foot's doing inside the shoe. Now, even if you could somehow see the foot inside the shoe, you still don't know what the bones are doing because the skin, right? Skin moves over bone. So, for example, here's a study where researchers inserted pins directly into the bones of the tibia and calcaneus to measure actual skeletal motion during running. And what they found was this. external markers on the shoe showed about 16 degrees of eversion, and the actual bone movement, 8.6 degrees. That's almost half. That's not a small error. That's completely a different picture. And the reason was simple. The shoe and the skin are moving independently of the bone. The foot moves inside the shoe, and the skin moves over the bone. So if someone gives you a pronation control shoe or an orthotic, you still have no idea what the bones are doing, since the foot moves around in the shoe and the bones move under the skin. So when someone tells you that you overpronate, you have to ask, compared to what? And measured how? And if you think the shoes are actually fixing the problem, listen to this. When researchers use those same bone pin methods to compare barefoot running to running in shoes, the difference in actual bone movement was about 1 to 3 degrees on average. 1 to 3 degrees was all the shoe did in changing the bone movement. So the shoe isn't really controlling your foot nearly as much as you've been led to believe. But the other finding that was notable in this study is what is also consistent across all of these studies. The finding is that high variability in responses when you apply the same intervention to people with the same foot type. So let me explain. In this paper, they say differences between shoe conditions were found to be small in the order of 1 to 3 degrees and inconsistent across subjects. The inconsistency of the response of each individual person to the orthotics or the shoe. So what do we mean by that? Well, they mean that if you think someone is overpronating and you put them in a motion control shoe or an orthotic, you may change the pronation or you might not. And the person may actually pronate more. For example, look at this paper where they used orthotics in people's shoes and found some subjects showed as much as a 10-degree increase and others a 5-degree decrease in peak rear foot eversion when comparing the inverted orthoses condition with no orthoses condition. This variability in responses to orthoses has been reported elsewhere. In other words, a lot of other studies show that when you give the same orthoses or foot orthotics to people with the same foot type, the reaction of what that person's foot does is widely variable individual to individual. Now that was just one study. This study was a large review of the effects of orthotics on the motion of feet, and they reported the results of most studies on medial wedges are inconclusive. So some studies show changes, others show no effect at all, and that's not at all what you'd expect if this was a reliable mechanical fix. And that's what you see when responses are highly individual and not predictable. So now we have 3 cracks in the foundation, right? A weak relationship between pronation or arch height and injury, unreliable measurements, and minimal and unpredictable actual changes at the bone level. Now, if there was validity in this approach, you would expect the opposite. You would expect a strong relationship with injury, you would expect that you could reliably measure it, and you would expect that interventions would create at least somewhat predictable changes. But we've just established that really, none of these elements exist. So why then are so many people being told they need lifelong support? And this is where things go from maybe this is overblown to this might actually be a problem. So hear me out on this, because supporting your foot is not just a neutral action. Over the long term, extra support may actually be detrimental. In order to explain that, let's talk about the interventions. If you've been told that you need orthotics or motion control shoes, what does the evidence actually say? Well, for acute injuries and pain, there is actually some evidence that orthotics can help. For plantar fasciitis, they provide modest, short-term pain relief. For military recruits undergoing intensive training, they can reduce stress fractures. That's legitimate. However, to be clear, and this is crystal clear in the research, customized orthotics that you spend $500 for are no better than off-the-shelf orthotics. This is seen over and over again in the research. Expensive custom orthotics are no better than the ones you can just pick off the shelf or order online. And more importantly, this is another critical distinction. When some studies show a small to modest reduction in pain in the short term, there is no evidence supporting long-term use of orthotics beyond the acute or subacute treatment phase if people are already in pain. The injury prevention studies are all short-term in high-intensity training contexts, and no one has ever shown that wearing orthotics for years prevents injuries or reduces pain. But, and this is a big but, let's talk about what happens when you do use orthotics or supportive shoes for the long term. You get weakening of the tissues. So here's a simple analogy. Let's say you sprain your shoulder. Would it be reasonable to put your shoulder in a sling for a little while you recover? Sure. But would you keep that sling supporting your arm for years? Of course you wouldn't, right? The muscles, the bones of the shoulder would certainly weaken. Well, it turns out orthotics and supportive shoes are no different. They weaken the foot structure over time. So here's just one example. A randomized control that looked at intrinsic foot muscles after just 12 weeks, right? 3 months of wearing custom orthotics. One muscle in the foot of people using the orthotics decreased by 9.6%, another by 17.1%, and another one by 17.4%. That's in 3 months. Now think about that for a second. If a medication caused a 17% reduction in muscle size, we'd be talking about it. But because this is a device, I guess we just assume it's harmless? Now, here's one thing that goes the other direction. This study was a meta-analysis of a lot of other studies that placed subjects in less supportive, more minimalist shoes. So they looked at 9 studies in total, and they found that when people slowly transitioned to minimalist shoes, they increased their foot muscle strength anywhere from 9 to 57%, depending on the study, and the muscle size increased by 7 to 10%. Now, this seems obvious, doesn't it? If you provide external support to any body part, any body tissue, and you make it work less, it will weaken. But if you make that body work a little bit more, it's actually going to get strengthened. And now we have lots of evidence that confirms that theory. But there's one more issue we need to discuss, and it might be the most important one. When a salesperson or a clinician tells you that you're built wrong or you move wrong and you need external support forever, what does that do to you psychologically? Well, people know about the placebo effect, right? You give someone a sugar pill and they feel better. There's something that's opposite of that called the nocebo effect. In telling someone that they have a structural problem creates fear, it promotes dependence on this passive intervention, and it can actually lead to worse long-term outcomes. That's a nocebo effect. Because at the same time, your foot is doing less work, you are also being told it can't do the work, that it's flawed, that it needs help, possibly forever. And that combination is powerful. You offload the system physically and you downregulate it mentally. So now we're not just using support, you're becoming reliant on it. Now again, to be clear, this doesn't mean that orthotics are bad. They can absolutely help in the short term. Pain reduction, load management, getting you through an irritated phase. That's all real. But that's very different from saying, you need this forever because of how your foot is built. Because if that were true, then strengthening the foot shouldn't really matter. And yet, when people transition towards more minimalist footwear, they actually train their feet and we consistently see increases in foot muscle strength and size, sometimes dramatically. So now you have to ask yourself a different question. Are we correcting the problem, or are we replacing a function? And this is where people get stuck, because if you've been in a supportive shoe or orthotics for years, your feet aren't ready to suddenly just take over. And this is the part where people get hurt, right? They hear a message like what I'm trying to say here, and then one day they just throw away their orthotics and they go into minimalist shoes. And a few weeks later, their feet are screaming. And so then they think, see, I needed the orthotics after all. But the reality is, their feet are sore not because their feet are built wrong. It's usually because the capacity of the structures of the foot were so low because they were using these supportive shoes or orthotics for so long, and then they abruptly take that support away. So if you do decide to move away from support, it should be gradual, measured, and respectful of your current capacity. The goal is to rebuild function. And so that might take a while, right? For example, if someone has been wearing supportive shoes or orthotics for years, they may want to stay in those supportive shoes for like 75% of the day, and the more minimalist shoes 25% of the day for a month or so. And then the next month, maybe they're in the supportive shoes for 50% of the days. And then the next month, maybe they're in the minimalist shoes for 75% of the day and the supportive shoes for 25% of the day. And then on the fourth month, maybe they're in total time in the minimalist shoes. But obviously that depends on your ability to adapt. So if you're older, if you have diabetes, if you have circulation problems, if you've been in these supportive shoes for years and years, these things and other things you need to consider with how long it would take your body to adapt. So let's just kind of zoom out for a second, because this picture is bigger than just feet. If you believe that your body's flawed, you'll always be looking for external fixes. Better shoes, more support, another insert. But if that belief is even partially wrong, then you've been giving away control of something that your body can actually adapt to. And this is where I think Benno Nig's work brings everything together. So Benno Nig is one of the most respected biomechanics researchers in the world. He's published over 400 scientific papers, written more than a dozen books, and spent decades studying running injuries. And his work suggests that trying to correct, quote unquote, things like pronation is probably missing the point. He concludes that many of the things that we thought mattered most, right, the things that we've covered in this video, don't actually consistently predict injury. So instead of trying to force people to correct movement, he proposes something different. That your body naturally finds a preferred movement path, and that you tend to select your footwear based on comfort, what he called comfort filter. In other words, your body is not a passive structure that needs to be corrected. It's an adaptive system that consistently tries to find what works. So instead of asking, what's wrong with my feet? A better question might be, what can my feet become capable of again? And that shift from correction to capacity is where you get control back.